Hi everyone, it's Courtney for Honeybee Stamps, and today we're going to be making a card using the Polygon Thin Frames dies, the birthday stamp, as well as the coordinating die set, and the In Full Bloom stamp set. And we're going to be using this large image here. So I went ahead and started by stamping out that large image onto a piece of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock. I'm using my mini Misty here because obviously this is quite a large image, and I did stamp it twice just to make sure that I have a bold black outline. Now, normally I do my die cutting last after I do all of my coloring, but I was too afraid that being I have to die cut two pieces from this, I ended up die cutting first before I did my coloring. Being it's such a large image, I didn't really have a problem. My biggest issue is holding everything down while I'm coloring, but in this case, it's so big that I didn't have an issue. So I lined up the outline of the image, held that down with some Post-it note tape, then lined up the inside portion of the frame. Again, stuck that down with some Post-it note tape and ran that through my Gemini. And you can see that you have a nice frame here. And now the coordinating dies come with these two dies. So you can keep it as one piece or actually cut out that frame, or both, like I did. So I'm going to keep the coloring pretty simple. I didn't leave in all of the coloring because it is quite repetitive. I'm going to start off with the leaves here, and I am starting right with my darkest color here and just adding a little bit of color with the darkest color to the base of each of the leaves, and some of the leaves I'm also adding a little bit to the tip depending on the shape, blending that out a little bit with the two mid-tone colors, and then I'll finish off with the highlight color. These leaves are pretty small, so you're not going to get all that much texture, but you can still get a lot of contrast. So I'm going to color my flowers with two different color combinations, and I'm just going to show you one of each flower so you can see those combinations and how I colored them. Now, I normally start off with my lightest color to map out my darkest areas and to get the paper nice and saturated so that my blend is a little bit more seamless. But in this case, I don't want my blend to be too seamless. I want to see my flick lines, and this just adds a little bit of texture. It's kind of as if you are coloring hair. So I'm starting with that V09, which is my darkest color. And for these teeny tiny petals that are kind of sticking out from the back, I'm not worried about doing any flicking motions here. There's not a whole lot of room to work with. And quite honestly, you're not going to notice if there's no texture back there. And the further back something gets anyway, you kind of lose the detail of it. So I'm pretty much just concentrating on the front petals. So next I'm going in with the V09, and I am continuing with these flicking motions in these larger areas, but I'm just extending the flicks that I already have down. And you'll notice that my flicks are different sizes, so some are a little bit longer and shorter than the others, and that's fine. That's just going to even add even more texture to the petals. Going to do the same thing with the V04, just extending these flicks out a little bit further. I am also making sure that I create a shadow where one petal is behind another, and also where some of the petals are kind of folded over on themselves. That would also create a shadow. So I'm going to finish off with my lightest color here, and you want to be careful not to go over your entire image. So you can see that I'm working on one petal at a time, and I'm going to work from the tip down. And I'm not going over the darkest area with this lightest color because it's going to act as a colorless blender, being it is so light, and I don't want to move that color around. One of the biggest mistakes made with alcohol markers is over blending. So next I'm going to move on to the BG combination, and I started with the BG18 but realized that's not my darkest color. So I'm going to move on to the BG78, and I'm going to color this little bud here. Now I am still using the flicking motions on the two front petals, but in the back where it's all kind of tucked together, again, not really worried about those flicking motions. So I went ahead and colored every other one purple and every other one teal for the flowers. And there's kind of little, I guess they're little berries. So obviously these are way too tiny to do any kind of shading at all. So I'm bringing in kind of a darker pink color, and I'm just using the tip of my marker. Whenever you have to get into a tiny area like this, you want to make sure that your marker is almost straight up and down, and that's going to allow you to get into those tiny areas. And I'm literally just dotting the marker down and quickly picking it up, the longer you have your marker down on the paper, the more that color is going to spread. Remember, this is alcohol ink in these markers, and alcohol ink spreads. So I did have a few coloring mistakes, nothing unusual for me. So I am going to take a white gel pen just to fix those areas up. You can certainly use a colorless blender depending on what color is out of the lines. If it's one of the darkest colors, like the V09 or BG78, I definitely don't recommend using a colorless blender there. It's just going to kind of muddy up the color a little bit. So it's just easier for me to use a white gel pen, especially being I already have this frame cut out. It's really easy to guide myself. So I went ahead and put this aside for a bit, and now I'm going to work on the center portion. So I'm going to bring out the polygon thin frames, and I went ahead and die cut them with some white cardstock. And I apologize, I forgot to zoom back out, but I promise you in just a minute, I did remember, and I will zoom back out. So you can see we have lots and lots of frames cut out from this die, and the largest one was just a little bit too big. But I'm going to bring out that center piece that we had cut out in the very beginning, and I'm just going to glue down these polygon frames to kind of create some texture and kind of create a background for the inside of my frame. I'm using some Tombow Mono Multi Glue. You can use the double-sided adhesive before you run it through your die cut machine, and that way it'll just stick right down without that all that glue squishing out. But making a mess is part of the fun, so I'm okay with that. But I kind of just dot the glue around the frame and then tuck it right directly next to the one I laid down previously. The Tombow Mono Multi Glue does set pretty quickly. It doesn't dry immediately, which I like because that gives me a couple of seconds to move things around if needed, but it still kind of adheres permanently within, I would say, about 15 seconds or so. Now I'm just working towards the middle here, and as I get towards the middle and the frames are getting smaller and smaller, I ended up just adding a little bit of glue to that center piece and then just fitting in the remaining pieces. I figured that was probably just a little bit easier. Now I do have a little bit of glue squished out in certain areas. I can clean that up later, but you want to make sure that the glue is completely dry before you try to clean up those areas. So I'm going to go ahead and put this aside to dry while I work on my background. Now, I know that I want this to be pretty much the entire card. It fills up almost an entire card, but I still didn't want to have a totally white background. So I'm taking another piece of Neenah Solar White. You can use watercolor paper for this, but I didn't add a whole lot of moisture, so it didn't really matter. I'm using the Peacock Feathers and Dusty Concord Distress Oxide inks and just a paintbrush. Going to water those down a little bit, and I'm just going to spatter the background with both of these colors. It's not going to be too much of an intense background, but it's going to have a little bit of, it's not just white. Let me just put it to you that way. I didn't want a plain white background. I wanted something. So it's kind of hard to tell on camera, but it adds just a little bit of color, and these colors naturally, they match the flowers that we colored. So again, you want to make sure you put this aside to dry as well. I didn't use watercolor paper, so I want to make sure that that is completely dry, and I'll work on the sentiment. So I'm going to use the word birthday and the smallest shadow. There's two shadows. I'm using the smallest one. I cut the word from black cardstock and the shadow with white. And again, I'm going to use that Tombow Mono Multi Glue to adhere these together. I definitely prefer to use the wet glue, especially for the sentiment dies, because I can never seem to line these up right the first time. And when I kind of go along the word, I'm not squeezing the bottle of glue at all. I'm just tipping it upside down and just dotting that along the word itself. And I find that that kind of prevents the glue from adding too much glue where it squishes out once you adhere that to the shadow. And this time I did remember to make sure that I saved the little dot to the eye. That is something that I typically forget, and by the time I realize it, it is long gone. So I usually have to run it through my die cutting machine again, but I remembered to save it this time. I'm going to take that scrap piece of black cardstock that we used to die cut the word, and I am going to treat that with my anti-static tool, and I'm using two of the sentiments from the birthday stamp set, which is the coordinating one to the die set. And I'm going to stamp these out with some Versamark ink. The first one was a little bit wonky, wasn't really straight, so I restamped that, and I'll stamp the other one, trying to line them up perfectly so I can get these into strips with just one easy cut. So sprinkled on some white embossing powder and then heat set that with my heat gun. You do want to make sure that you didn't do what I did, and you want to be sure that the embossing powder is nice and melted and then cooled before you wipe off your card panel or your card stock to get that anti-static powder gone. I didn't wait long enough and I kind of smeared the U out of the word U. So I just touched that up with a white gel pen. Being I used white embossing powder, just touching that up with a white gel pen, nobody's ever going to know the difference. So I cut these down into 2 small strips and I'm going to put those aside to adhere to my card last. So now that all the squished out glue from my polygon frames is dry, I can go ahead and remove all of the excess. Now there is an adhesive eraser. Mine has seemed to grow legs and walk away, and I haven't found it in several weeks. So I am just going to use a sand eraser, and that seemed to work fine. I was able to get that excess residue off. So next we're going to adhere everything together. So that piece of cardstock that we had for the spatter background was cut just a little bit smaller than an A2 size card. I am adhering this to a piece of black cardstock that is just a little bit larger than that one, but still just a teeny tiny bit smaller than the A2 size card base. That way I have a little bit of a black background or a little bit of a black outline as well as a little bit of a white outline, and this seems to really make your panel pop off the page. Next, I can adhere my frame. So I'm going to take the flower frame and I am going to line this with some Scotch foam tape all around. I'm going to pop that up directly in the center of my card base, or my card panel, I should say. And I want there to be kind of multiple dimensions here. So I'm going to line that up the best I can in the center, but the center of the frame, the one with the polygon frames, I'm going to adhere flat. And being this is cut with the same image, you can say, it's really easy to fit inside. Again, I am going to use wet glue because it is easier to shimmy around as needed. And then I can adhere all of my words. So I lined up my large birthday and realized that, well, I kind of knew ahead of time, but it was a little bit larger than the inside of the frame. So in order to make this appear as if it's kind of flat across the panel, I need to add a little bit of foam tape in the center where the inside of the frame is kind of dipped down a little bit. So I added just teeny tiny squares to the middle of the word and then just a few dots of glue on the outside of the word that's going to be over the flowers, being the flower part of the frame is already popped up. So I hope that makes sense. And then I can take a little bit of Scotch foam tape to adhere my sentiment strips on the top and bottom of my large word. I finished off the card with a little bit of shimmer with a Nuvo Aqua shimmer pen just to the flowers, and that is it. That is the card for today. As always, I will leave the supplies listed in the description box below. Thank you guys so much for stopping by today, and have a great day. Bye.